Up, we have a panel discussion hosted on supply chain visibility by Chris Kinane. And so I'll hand over to you, Chris, before I drop out.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Chris Kinane. I'm a research director at ARC Advisory Group. In that role, I head up research around transportation management systems, transportation execution and visibility systems, as well as omnichannel fulfillment. I'm a contributing author for Logistics Viewpoints. And I'm very pleased to be here moderating the panel, Supply Chain Visibility for a Connected, Customer-Focused Business. So what I'm going to do is give a brief introduction to our esteemed panelists, and then we can get right into the discussion. Russ is Technology Officer at GlobalTran. Russ brings over 25 years of experience in product development and technology leadership to GlobalTrans and is responsible for all technology at GlobalTrans. With experience across diverse industries and technologies, Russ has led the creation of multiple technology products, solving issues within business process optimization, IT management, and storage and blockchain. He brings not only a broad technology background, but experience in creating quality-first development organizations. Prior to joining GlobalTrans, Russ held multiple CTO, IT, and technology leadership positions, most recently providing technology advisory services for multiple private equity firms to drive portfolio improvement, advise on technology company acquisition strategy, and decrease time to value. Colin Yankee serves as Executive Vice President, Chief Supply Chain Officer of rural lifestyle retailer Tractor Supply Company, and is a member of the company's executive committee. In this role, Colin has responsibility for merchandise planning, inventory management, vendor operations, transportation, and distribution center activities, as well as the continuous improvement and growth strategies for the supply chain. Luis Pajares serves as the Chief Revenue Officer at Turvo. He brings over 30 years of experience in software and cloud technologies in both large publicly traded and startup companies. Luis's career has been focused on finding and developing disruptive technologies that modernize industries. At Turvo, Luis is focused on applying his knowledge and experience in digital transformation to the logistics industry to create the world's first collaborative logistics solution to unify every person, system, and organization in the supply chain. In his previous role as Group Vice President for Oracle Communications, he was a senior member of the leadership team responsible for strategy with oversight of worldwide sales, alliances, and partnerships. Chris Hughes is Managing Director and Practice Leader of Transportation and Logistics at G2 Capital Advisors. Chris has nearly 30 years of successfully crafting and executing both top-line growth and operating margin expansion strategies within supply chain, logistics, e-commerce, and transportation, and across an array of industry verticals. G2 Capital Advisors is a Boston-based boutique lower middle market investment banking and advisory firm, and in his capabilities there, Chris is responsible for successfully leading the firm's transportation and logistics clients through a variety of buy and sell side M&A transactions and complex financial restructuring engagements. And last but not least is Edward Barabal, partner at McKinsey & Company. Ed is focused on manufacturing, supply chains, and logistics. In this capacity, he as industrial companies along with government agencies as they improve their operations. Ed is also a leader in McKinsey's research on supply chain risk and resilience. He is based in Washington, D.C. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the five of you for joining me today for the panel.
Great, thanks, Chris.
Supply chain visibility is a much discussed term in the industry. What does supply chain visibility mean to you, and how does it impact the end customer? Start with you on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it is it's a necessity, I guess. When you think about what does it mean to me specifically, but I think the most interesting part is how does that impact the customer, and how does that impact the person that's really kind of managing that supply chain, creating the shipments, creating the network, creating kind of in charge with that optimization. And so, the ability to identify risk, the ability to really see and get visibility into not just the individual moves, but how those all interconnect and how they can work together to create optimization or to impact optimization negatively, I think is a key point for really visibility for the customer and moving it beyond the tactical. So much of what we I think talk about, or what we think about when it comes to visibility these days, does tend to move down into the tactical. And the big impact to the customer, though, is not in where is the blue dot, which we all are familiar with the blue dot, but what does the blue dot being here instead of here actually mean to me as a customer in my network, in my supply chain, with my suppliers, and with my processes that are downstream from that particular blue dot and whatever it may be moving for me. And so that to me is where we really have opportunity, I think, to tailor and to bring the visibility up into that strategic level and out of the tactical level, as supply chain professionals, and everyone from shippers to 3PLs, as we are, to suppliers, and to the suppliers and the downstream tiers.
Great. Chris, can you share your thoughts on what supply chain visibility means to you and the impact on the end customer?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's primarily about allowing supply chain partners, customers, to clear away the mountains of, a lot of times, non-essential data that they receive on a day-to-day basis. You're sort of inundated with information with the advent of all sorts of ERP and TMS systems and things like that, order management systems. And, to be able to distill that down into kind of a meaningful and digestible portion of information, really the necessary information to be able to make decisions around the business. So for me, it's simply more efficient and productive management of finite resources at the end of the day.
Luis, do you have any thoughts on this question as well?
Yes. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me. I think Russ and Chris said it very well. I would add, the supply chain is a very fragmented group of people, systems, and technology. So we're talking about visibility on this panel today because we're trying to find a better understanding of what's happening throughout that supply chain. And I think we're craving more or better visibility to address this. But the root cause is that the technology that has served the supply chain hasn't been able to really connect this fragmented group of people, systems, and technology. So let me give you an example. So if I were to ask you to define a social network, all of us would say, a social network is made up of fragmented people and organizations, and they come together around a shared common interest. You can invite people into this social network. You can be invited into these social networks. But if you think of what the social network does, it's providing visibility to a shared group of people around those common interests. So when I think about visibility in our industry, I think about visibility being a feature, but I think the real root cause that we need to resolve is how do we bring a B2B social network to the supply chain? And this is what, I'll start calling collaborative logistics. And once you can bring about this collaborative logistics, you can improve that visibility amongst all the shippers and carriers and logistics service providers, Chris.
Thank you for those insights. Yeah, I definitely agree with all three of you and sort of your perspectives on how that impacts the end customer. Now, Colin and Ed, I didn't give you a chance to answer that question, but I'd like to get your thoughts on, what are some of the biggest barriers to end-to-end visibility in the supply chain? Colin, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, thanks. I think the comments from Russ, Luis, and Chris show that in general, we're talking about the same set of capabilities. I think Luis hit on it well, but because in practice, there are a lot of barriers. So I'm really bullish on the promise of end-to-end visibility, because I can imagine what Luis was talking about. I can imagine what's possible. I can see an end-to-end control tower built on a supply chain digital twin that has visibility to each of the nodes in my supply chain and supports automated decision-making. I can imagine it, but in reality, it's really fragmented and functionally based at this point. So at my company, at Tractor Supply, supply chain visibility is one of our major pillars for digitizing our operations. And we've got a really simple goal. We just want earlier visibility to vendor production and transportation issues so we can use that information to reallocate resources or inventory and better serve our customers. And while I believe in the promise of end-to-end visibility, we are not close to being there yet. And there are really three consistent barriers that have been part of every conversation we've had. First has really been visibility is not a solution for bad process. So we've adopted the approach of process before technology and tried to mature our operations to a point where the technology would be an enabler rather than trying to layer technology on top of bad process, because we think that would lead to a false start and erode support for the overall effort. Second, gaps in foundational planning systems or execution systems can present barriers to building internal visibility. So that makes it hard internal, but also external. So those need to be addressed as part of the overall visibility initiative. And third, I think this is a very consistent topic, is the quality, accessibility, and fidelity of data. So whether that's internally with our own supply chain, with our suppliers, our carriers, or how a particular visibility platform is using and projecting that data, that has been a place where we've spent a lot of time so that we can trust the visibility and then the analytics that are utilizing that data. So I think those are three very consistent barriers for us.
Thank you, Colin. Ed, what do you see as the biggest barriers to end-to-end visibility in the supply chain?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I think Colin laid out and really nicely a lot of what we see. I think the data issue is a really big one, and folks have gone around and said, there are some folks out there who might say this is a problem you can solve with AI or machine learning, and frankly, it's just, in our experience, not. To actually be able to start to do this, you need to bring together a mosaic of data. You have data that you can purchase from outside providers about what supply networks look like, and merge that together to start to get an idea of who am I actually buying from, who are my suppliers buying from. And the second thing that we see folks struggle a bit with is even once you have all that information, we think part of visibility is also understanding where your vulnerabilities and risks sit in the supply chain. And for a lot of folks, I think that's a new muscle to be working. We thought about supply chains very much as a cost center, a place to get productivity. There's been less conversation about how do we balance resiliency in that equation. And that's folks I think are coming around to right now as well. On the transparency and visibility discussion is, where do the risks sit once I even know who I'm buying from?
Great. So obviously over the last 7 months, probably the biggest topic and the biggest issue, the biggest news item that we've seen, especially the supply chain, has been around COVID-19. And, we continue to see disruptions, delays. So Chris, how do you see the recent and continuing COVID environment affecting or changing the way companies are thinking about the investment in and application of visibility tools?
Yeah, Chris, I think probably two primary ways. First, across almost every sector in the supply chain, we saw, I'm sure everyone on this panel saw and continue to see really dramatic imbalances and shortages across different types of resources. So whether that's driver, warehouse labor, ocean capacity, containers, chassis, over-the-road freight, you name it. And anytime you have imbalances in supply chain resources of that nature, you have to have better visibility on where stuff is and how you're going to get it from A to B. And while imbalances, they're pretty normal occurrences in supply chain, I think COVID definitely drove a larger degree of volatility than we've historically seen. And then second, COVID stay-at-home orders really drove the number of B2B and B2C orders. So online ordering through the roof, like something that we haven't seen ever. And it's going to continue to trend that way. So many folks who had not previously bought items online are really now doing that at levels we've never seen. And importantly, I think across a number and broader array of products. So not just essential items. And as that comfort level grows, and as the last mile delivery components and fulfillment networks improve to support it, the need for greater real-time visibility on order and delivery status is definitely placing pressure, I think, on providers of the services to really up their game. So those two drivers, in my opinion, have in turn either one, stressed and exposed some interesting cracks in the technology architecture of a lot of companies who may have thought they had made the right investments coming into 2020 and had good technology stacks to handle it, but in reality didn't. or it flagged new and what I'll call opportunistic ways for logistics businesses or software providers to now differentiate themselves by offering some unique service offerings or visibility tools to fill a niche that was exposed. So I think the immediate need for more collaborative visibility, as we've just talked about in the supply chain, puts you in either a have or a have not category. And either way, I think you felt it, pretty significantly through COVID.
Yeah, the e-commerce surge definitely brought along a lot of difficulties for a lot of companies when looking at sort of the fragility of their supply chains. I remember seeing a statistic that said in May alone, e-commerce sales surpassed all of 2019's holiday season, and that's something that I don't think will be changing anytime soon. And so, Ed, a question for you on a similar note. Why has it taken till the world to appreciate the risks of globalized supply chains?
I think COVID's been the biggest shock in the past decade or so, but different industries have experienced events that have made them think about this over the past decade. You look at auto with the 2011 tsunami in Japan, realize concentration of production in one region can be very risky in regionalized supply chains. You look at pharma after Hurricane Maria in 2017, realize the concentration of production down in Puerto Rico presented some risks, and companies that had thought about that beforehand were able to manage the disruptions better. So different industries have faced these sorts of shocks. COVID, I think, has been the broadest one, and it's been both a demand and a supply shock. And you have some companies that have so many orders that they don't even know how to begin to start to think about producing to fulfill them. On the other side, you have some companies where demand's fallen off a cliff and they have plenty of inventory but can't get to market or can't sell it. So I think it's just been the broadest shock. It's affected almost every industry. And that's why I think this has really drawn out the awareness of some of the vulnerabilities that the supply chains we've built over the past 2 decades have.
So sort of shifting gears a little bit, moving away from COVID, Colin, a question for you. With the layers to achieving end-to-end supply chain visibility, how do you decide where to start?
Yeah, I think it's an important decision where you start because there's so much opportunity in this area. And we all operate with constraints on our resources and our attention. So we have to be really judicious about where we put our effort. When we started our visibility journey, we did an exercise called painting the chain, where we mapped our level of visibility at each leg of the supply chain. And we kept the goal of driving on time and in full performance as the primary objective, because that's super important to us. At each place where we did that paint the chain, we assessed the existing level of visibility we had into the status of the product. So what do we know and what would we like to know about each purchase order and shipment? Then we looked at it from the transportation mode level. So how much visibility did we have and how much did we need by mode? And then how do we pull those two things together and use that product visibility and that transportation visibility to make better decisions? And that helped us decide where the best use cases were, the level of complexity involved, and frankly, our readiness to invest in the capability. So while we could have started anywhere in the chain, we decided to start with 2 things: collect truckload transportation for visibility, and our S&OP process for decision support tools. But I think that same prioritization process would work for most shippers.
Now, there's a lot of talk around, granularity of visibility. Russ, what is that right granularity of visibility? And, how much is too much?
Yeah, that's a wonderfully tricky question because it's a little bit different depending on, kind of who you're talking to and where they sit in the chain and the number of inflows and outflows that exist within that particular point. But, I think there's a couple of things that granularity has brought up. And, one of the big ones is it's a double-edged sword. So, you can get on platforms that provide ridiculous amounts of granularity, but if you surface all of that granularity all the time, all it becomes is noise. That you're just this influx of information without having, kind of importance or urgency attached to any one of the communications. And so I think when you look at the right granularity of visibility, you have to have some sort of a tool set. And, you know, we've kind of talked about some of those things when some of the other answers, you know, at least talked about it from the perspective of how do you think about globalized supply chains? How do you think about, you know, the barriers to end-to-end visibility and things like that? But you have to have tools that bring this information together and that allow for that kind of dialing up and down of the granularity, not just in a broad brush or peanut butter type stroke, but within specific areas. Especially as you start to see trends in an area, you need to be able to dial that up or dial it back down and do that in a more real-time basis. You know, mentioned add the AI and, you know, kind of ML and, oh, put AI and ML on it. Yeah, okay, it's now it's smart, right? And it's more about, you still need that recognition of the issue. And that's really not what AI and ML are good at. They don't recognize trends. They're good at actually tracking the trend once you see it, but they're not so good at recognizing that. And so having a system in place to regulate that granularity, I think, is key. And then when you say how much is too much, every customer is a little bit different when it comes to tolerance of what they want and what they're even capable of ingesting on a daily basis and on an hourly basis, or even a minute by minute basis. And so you have to take that user-centric approach. You have to take that, you know, positional approach of where they are in the supply chain, and, you know, give them the information that's relevant to them based on what they are doing. You know, because it's very different in what does visibility mean to, for example, a shipment level director versus a logistics coordinator. Very different roles and very different, you know, kind of granularity needs when it comes to visibility. So I think when you talk about how much is too much, you have to think of, who am I talking to? And am I giving them the right level and degree and frequency of information given where they are and what their responsibilities are?
So one of the things you mentioned was, you know, using different tools to enable visibility. Luis, does creating a collaborative logistics network drive greater visibility across supply chains? And if so, how?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, if you solve for collaborative logistics, you solve for visibility. And I liked what Colin and Russ were talking about, how much visibility is the right amount. You know, I'd add that it's about contextual visibility, right? So to the point that Russ was making, different people needs visibility to different things in different ways at different times. So contextual visibility is really, really important. But again, as I think about, if we can solve for collaborative logistics, we solve for that visibility. And then when you think about what you have, you can start thinking about where your data lakes are, where your analytics, and then you can get fancier and start talking about machine learning and AI. But I believe collaborative logistics is the game changer that will bring this fragmented industry together so that visibility is contextual across all the constituents. And you said, and how do you do that? Again, borrowing from technology that everyone's familiar with. You know, before the internet protocol existed, IP, you know, the World Wide Web wasn't going to be collaborative where anybody can just jump on without, you know, some sort of data protocol or EDI or some sort of, you know, duct tape connection. So technology has to be powerful enough to solve for collaborative logistics. And then I think visibility and everything that it brings solves itself.
Luis, a follow-up question to that. Does a collaborative logistics network then lead to a differentiated customer experience that, you know, logistics service providers and shippers can offer to their customers?
Yes, I think it does. And more importantly, you know, that better customer experience actually improves revenue, which improves profitability. And so let me give you some examples. You know, I heard Robert Sanchez today talk about Ryder. Ryder's a partner of Turvo. He talked about Ryder Share, and they've launched rideshare to digitize their customer experience and solve for collaborative logistics. And some of the key metrics that they're measuring and they're seeing because they've solved for collaborative logistics is that their customers, their shipper customers, are now recognizing revenue 5 days faster than normal. Now, when you have millions and millions of loads times 5 days, that revenue impact is pretty significant. Another metric that they talk about is OpEx. Customer satisfaction. I'll get to OpEx in a minute, where when you bring collaborative logistics to the forefront, they've seen their customer satisfaction scores for on-time deliveries move from 95 to 99%. So very powerful. One last example, Lineage, another partner of ours, they're the world's largest cold storage company. You know, they've just launched Lineage Link, and Lineage Link again is tackling collaborative logistics to bring a better customer experience, and that customer experience is driving down their OpEx costs by tens of millions of dollars because trucks and dock workers and shipper loads are all arriving at the right time because that visibility is working for everyone. So Chris, yes, I think collaborative logistics does drive a better customer experience, which is going to drive better revenue and better profitability.
Now, Russ, what role should standards such as communications and data formats play in the quest to improve visibility, and really who should drive those standards?
Yeah. So now we get into the really fun part that everybody likes to talk about, which are standards and things like that, right? But and before I answer this, I wanted to just, Luis, what you're talking about with the collaborative, piece and things like that and driving profitability, I think is important. One of the keys to that social, that collaborative network or that social network is that there's this kind of everybody has an incentive or a reason to be on it, and making sure that we figure out how those incentives don't just occur at the top level at the profits and things like that, but also even down into the driver of the truck needs a reason to be included and inclusive of this type of collaborative network, because so much of this, yes, can be done through things like IoT and other electronic means of data collection and data transmission, but there are still events that need to occur and that have to be recorded and have to be noticed for you to get that kind of true understanding. And so having those incentives and having those reasons for people to be involved is critical. It flows into the standards though. So, one of the things that's come up a lot with COVID, and, because we have to bring up COVID multiple times throughout any conversation in 2020, is that we are not a paperless, industry. There's a lot of people handing people other pieces of paper and signing them and handing them back and things like that. And as we got into the throes of the March, April, May, especially timeframes, and it was like, you may be really nice, but I don't want to be near you. It was, handing that piece of paper over and handing that and having that kind of chain of custody be much more tactile started to become an issue. And I think it brought to light some of the lack of standards. I feel like in some ways we're at the point that electronic medical record systems or electronic health record systems were at the big end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, where they were standing up all these things to capture data, but had no formality of how they talk to each other. And so, both of your doctors might have a way of keeping your data electronically, and they had no way to get it to each other. And so they would print it and fax it. And that's what they would do. And we're kind of at that point where we have these systems that exist and that capture pieces of information, but they don't have a clear method of handing information off, maintaining chain of custody and maintaining that visibility of kind of the sanctity of the information as it traverses through a more electronic path. And that's, to me, where standards and that type of work could start to really provide some expertise, just as the initial HL7 and the later FHIR protocols did for the healthcare industry. And hey, how do we talk? And how do we make sure that's secure? And how do I make sure it's you telling me, and it's not like somebody else, that I'm not supposed to be listening to? And so that's the challenge, I think, that's in front of us. And I think there's, the TIAA and some of the other bodies that exist across transportation are starting to get involved in that. But how we evolve from that more policy-based focus to that more communication-based focus, and the security and sanctity of that communication protocol is a change for our industry, and one that's going to take some time to get through, and need a lot of players involved to kind of help out and help it come to fruition.
One of the other major I'd say trends that we've seen over the last few years has really been the evolution of omnichannel retailing, and sort of as technology has improved, integration has improved. So Colin, what role is supply chain visibility playing in the evolution of omnichannel retail?
Hey Chris, visibility is fundamental in omnichannel retail. Simply said, you can't sell what you can't see. So operating in an omnichannel environment adds complexity for forecasting where do you position inventory geographically, but also how much inventory do you position in DCs and how much inventory do you position in stores. So you need to have really accurate and dynamic visibility to DC level, store level, and in-transit inventory in order to do that. So the more fulfillment nodes that are getting activated between DC fulfillment, buy online, pick up in store, store level fulfillment, et cetera, the more complex forecasting becomes, the more inventory is accessible to the customer, and the more important visibility is. So we're finding that not just the accuracy, but the visibility of all those different nodes and in transit is absolutely essential.
I think customer expectations have also been, one of the major driving factors for, for fueling omnichannel fulfillment. So with that being said, customers have also come to expect supply chains to be super efficient. Ed, do you think customers will be willing to pay more in the future for more efficiency?
This is the $1 million question that everyone's trying to answer coming out of COVID is, where is that going to go? I think the answer, at least initially, is for a lot of companies, there's still room to get more resilient and more efficient. Like I said before, I think a lot of companies have looked at their supply chain solely as a productivity engine before, and how do we get costs out of this? How do we get leaner? I think when you start to apply the lens of how do we build something that's both resilient and lean, you actually can find a lot of ways that you can do that initially can make you more productive. So to Colin's point around getting more visibility, if you don't have that and you do that, you may find I'm holding more inventory in certain spots that I need to. I'm reliant for one supplier on a particular commodity that I could be sourcing more competitively. All those sorts of things that let you pull levers to get more efficient and also probably build some resiliency in the system. I think the bigger question for me is, do we actually use COVID as a moment where investors, customers, and executives are going to say, let's actually make the system more resilient? Because by all research that we've done, the world's getting more risky. It's not just that supply chains are more vulnerable. The climate is changing. You're having more cyber events. All sorts of things are increasing with the threat surface changing. And so given that, is this the moment that we all kind of jointly hold each other accountable to have a resilient and efficient supply chain? Or do we just go back to how we were doing business before, which is a low-cost supply chain that's vulnerable to potential disruption? I think that's the big question. And it'll flow through in different industries as to whether or not it's more expensive. Like I say, we don't think it necessarily needs to be, at least at the start. That's our perspective.
Well, obviously making a supply chain more resilient and more efficient takes money. So Chris, where do you see capital flowing from investors to address current supply chain gaps, and why?
Yeah, so maybe as a corollary to my earlier comments around COVID, I'll use that word again, Russ, and some of the emerging players who have started to capitalize on some of the weaknesses that were exposed. You know, at G2, we've seen a ton of interest in deal activity across both our buy and sell side M&A market teams, probably beginning around May, early June of this year, as people were kind of coming out of understanding, investors that is, coming out understanding what their portfolios were looking like, kind of performing a little triage on those companies that were maybe heavily concentrated in non-essential categories and that kind of thing. But as deal activity is starting to come back online, there's really around the transportation and logistics space, probably 4 areas that there's some commonality. 1, sharing of assets. 2, finding capacity. 3, improving labor productivity, getting more efficient around that. And 4, enhancing any kind of fulfillment and last mile delivery capability. So supply chain visibility companies, I think like Project 44, who are kind of capitalizing on this kind of growing awareness that it's not necessarily important to control or even own the physical assets to move product, but it is important to do that efficiently and cost effectively. So by providing real-time visibility to shipment movements and so on and so forth, it's important so that brands can then kind of focus their time, attention, and resources on competing in the market through merchandising or winning on price or quality, right? And I think of companies like Stored and Flexi, who provide on-demand warehousing and transportation capacity, largely for small and medium-sized companies. So again, a lot of these small and medium-sized businesses are looking for alternatives, looking for networks and systems to support a really, really high growth and demand for products coming online. And so concepts of supply and demand exchange technologies, where you're pairing up supply and demand, whether that's warehouses, private and public warehouses or transportation assets, I think is going to be something that's going to continue to see capital flowing. Naturally, you see and have seen probably in the last 10 years, but probably more so now in the advent of omnichannel distribution, is capital going to automation and robotics to improve labor productivity and so on and so forth. So companies like Six River Systems have just seen a lot of tremendous capital influx to that business, or Next Shift Robotics here in Massachusetts. And then lastly, you have the highly focused B2C kind of fulfillment players like ShipBob and others who have continued to attract good capital to grow their networks out and support it. But interestingly, though, we're also seeing even the more traditional transportation and warehousing players and intermodal companies like JB Hunt or CRST making a ton of acquisitions in last mile delivery, as an example, to try to support and augment their historically retail-based operations to be able to handle more omni-channel consumption and all the kind of unique fulfillment and delivery requirements that come along with it.
So I do want to touch on supply chain resiliency for one more question. Russ, how do you take base visibility data and effectively apply that to problems such as supply chain resiliency and optimization?
Yeah, it's about, again, applying that kind of analytical mindset around things like alternative sourcing, leveraging of things like multi-stop shipments or DC locations, and some of the groups that Chris was mentioning around, like kind of the more contract warehousing or the pop-up warehousing players have started to help with that. As you think about how can you not just ensure consistent delivery within an existing network, but how you can alter that network more on the fly than you thought about maybe in the past. I think that's one of the big things that came up through everything we've gone through this year. I'm trying not to say it again. We all know what it is, right? You got to figure out how do I, it's not about just optimizing, but it's about having those warm relationships amongst kind of almost parallelized points on your supply chain, and using visibility information and the analysis that can be done around that incoming visibility information helps you to identify where you have maybe single point, single choke points where you can see everything's kind of funneling through one place, and allows you to start to spread that out and understand how you can better parallelize those and keep some multi-channel flows going, so that you don't run into a situation where you've got an interruption with whatever it is, weather related or pandemic related or whatever, that brings your supply chain to a halt or dramatically affects it enough that it has the same basic effect. And so I think that's where you can use a lot of that visibility data by plugging it in and leveraging it within those kind of network modeling and network optimization type tool sets to really identify those points.
Great. So I know we're getting towards the end of the panel. I have one more question I want to put out to you, Colin, and then I'd ask that everyone sort of expand upon it a little bit. So Colin, how do you articulate the clear benefits of supply chain visibility to internal stakeholders and external partners to get their buy-in and support? And then, what would you say is the single biggest benefit of supply chain visibility? And, after Colin answers, I'd like to open up that question to everyone on really what the biggest benefit is.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I walk around my organization trying to evangelize for digitizing the operations and synchronizing supply chain, and people who aren't in this field is going to glass over, right? And so I think like any business case, it's the combination of the science, so the objective outcomes, and the art, so using a friction point that's known in the organization as a relevant example for the problem to be solved. So, as Russ mentioned, it could be COVID or, supply chain resiliency, or something as simple as on-time delivery to a store, right? You got labor sitting around waiting for a truck to arrive. So on the objective side, for visibility, what I've seen it come in a few different forms: improved on-time delivery, reduced compliance charges, carrier collaboration, tender acceptance, labor scheduling, accuracy and utilization of inventory, or slotting, planogram type shifts, like things that people who can really sink their teeth into. And it's about pulling that together with the problem. And as a retailer, the key stakeholders that I have are our merchants and our stores. And if I can win their support and explain and problems be solved for them, then I gain a lot of benefits internal to the supply chain operations. So that's how we've tried to articulate it.
Great. So Ed, what would you say is the single biggest benefit of supply chain visibility?
Yeah, I think Colin had a lot of good points. For me, the biggest one that we've seen play out to the current crisis and previous ones, as well as the day-to-day things that go wrong, is just the agility and the awareness. It's really hard to react to surprises, either small daily ones or big ones. If it takes you days and phone calls and, to Russ's point, faxes and pieces of paper to put together where everything is and what's going on. And when things go wrong, if you have the ability to figure out where everything is, what orders are coming in, which suppliers are down, which aren't, that sort of information can be very, very, give you a real advantage in situations where you're facing some sort of disruption. So the agility, I think, is one of the biggest benefits.
Chris, how about you? What do you see as the biggest benefit of visibility?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add too much more than what's been said, but I would just say return on assets, right? Which is kind of a broad description, but think about people's time or actual resources that are going into a product to be sold, or lead times or inventory carrying costs, all those things that ultimately get impacted negatively when you don't have visibility to something, you don't know what's coming your way. And so I think I alluded to it earlier. It's about kind of boiling things down to literally the most important piece of information that an individual, regardless of his or her role in the company, has to act upon, and being able to proactively provide that to the individual without a lot of work, right? And then help prioritize the workload within the organization to drive benefits. But at the end of the day, that should net out as a key metric of return on assets. So you should be able to reduce the number of assets you're using to generate more profit, more customer sales, or whatever it is the objective is for that day.
Luis, do you want to share what you see as the biggest benefit, or can you give us an example of how a digital network can drive efficiencies?
Yeah, so I think they've all said it pretty well. It drives better customer experience, which drives more business, more revenue, more profitability. And the rule of thought around efficiency, right? The non-digital brokers in our industry, typically the rule of thumb is you have one employee for every $1 million of freight management. So if you're $100 million non-digital broker LSP, you've got about 100 people. When you start digitizing, you can now see that same number of people drive $1.3, $1.4 million of freight under management. So yeah, the digitization brings lots of efficiency, but putting a bow around it all, it's to drive a better customer experience for your customers and the partners in your supply chain.
And Russ, I'll give you the last word on the big benefits of supply chain visibility.
So I mean, again, I'll echo. A lot of, I think the big benefits have been covered. The one that I'll kind of end with here is tying in a little bit, what Ed had mentioned and what Colin had mentioned, which is how do you then articulate that to get the backing of the organizations, of the network to do it. The phrase I like is, surprises are for birthdays, not for business. And that to me sums up why visibility is important. Because as Ed mentioned, a surprise, drives more activity and more lost time than just about any other activity. Doesn't matter how much you do to kind of, value stream out your process and get bits of efficiency here and there in each step of the process and automate pieces of it and things like that. One surprise anywhere in that chain that just jacks it up instantly throws all that out the window. And you've lost all of those efficiencies that you've worked so hard to gain and to institutionalize within your organization.
Well, Colin, Russ, Luis, Chris, and Ed, thanks for joining me on today's panel on supply chain visibility. I think you guys shared some really incredible insights, and it was great to really be able to hear from some experts in the field on sort of what was going on and what the future looks like for supply chain visibility. So again, thank you for joining me today.